I'll start by trying to practice some of that which I'll talk about later in relation to management information by giving you my bottom line up front. This is in essence that we all need to be vigilant in guarding against poor corporate governance and poor corporate culture. And there are some practices we may wish to consider to maintain or improve our vigilance. I'll now explain how I arrive at that point, considering the interaction of financial services regulation with financial services firms over the past few years. Certainly it's the case that the years after 2008 saw a huge increase in the intensity and the scope of prudentially focused regulation. Much of this was understandable, and much of this was worthwhile. There were, however, some excesses with zealots pursuing aims other than the greatest happiness of the greatest possible number, something which requires the regulation of the financial services sector so as to permit it to enhance economic life, as well as ensuring a reasonable degree of security against systemic financial collapse, sometimes called the macroprudential dimension. Recently, there have been a number of signs that the spring tide of prudential regulation has passed its high water mark. And do bear in mind, I did write most of this before Mr. Trump was elected, so I'll just get to that in a second. But with such things as delegated regulation 10/16/47, the European Union reduces capital requirements for insurers operating under Solvency II for investing in qualified infrastructure projects. There's also some consideration being given to whether the risk margins set in Solvency II are excessive in what has become a sustained, or at least it was sustained until last week, ultra-low interest rate environment. Looking beyond the European Union at the work we are undertaking at the International Association of Insurance Supervisors to develop a new international capital standard, we've got a strong desire to increase the comparability of insurance capital so that comparisons can more easily be made between the performance and security of internationally active insurance firms domiciled in different jurisdictions. But we have next to no desire to increase the quantum of capital held against given risk. Our motivations are different from those of the authors of the Basel III banking capital standard written a few years ago. Turning to Basel III, in terms of banking capital, there is increased recognition that there is a lack of liquidity in some traded markets in times of stress, perhaps because the capital charges placed on investment banks' trading books by Basel III make the warehousing of stock and market making relatively unattractive businesses for banks to be in, given the alternative uses for the much increased capital now required. Then turning to IOSCO, the International Organization of Securities Commissions, it decided not to advance proposals to label the world's largest asset managers as systemic in its decision of the 17th of June 2015. It has said that priority will now be given to a broader study of asset management activities. It's probably fair to regard this as a victory for the industry, which lobbied policymakers to treat it differently from the other financial service sectors on the basis that it doesn't take risks on its balance sheets in the same way as banks as insurers. And finally, of course, Donald Trump being elected as the next president of the United States on a pledge to roll back financial services regulations such as Dodd-Frank may presage a rather more radical reform, though honestly it's difficult to be sure of the direction of any such reform this early in the formation of the new US administration. These views, even the election of Mr. Trump, do not suddenly invalidate prudential regulation as a concept. It's noteworthy that even Mr. Trump's champions in the US House of Representatives talk about having more capital as a substitute for prescriptive regulation. But rather, they serve to remind us of something which King Athelstan found more than 1,000 years ago in the 930s, namely that the social ills cannot be merely cured through legislation. He was a very devout man, as well as being a noteworthy warrior and administrator who unified the kingdom from Land's End to north of Edinburgh. He found, however, that the laws he passed could not eliminate poverty and secure for all his people enough food to guard against hunger. The recent adaptations to prudential regulations and the associated reduction in prudential ambition serve as a recognition that international policymakers, politicians, central bankers and regulators have recognized that the problems generated by financial services firms cannot simply be resolved by requiring more capital. Where does that leave us? Where now? I think the slight drawing back of the capital tide may indicate that we've arrived at a subtler place in working out how to deal with the very real problems financial services firms continue to generate. whilst at the same time allowing them to play a significant role in facilitating the economic activity on which rest our prospects for improving global living standards. What is sadly clear is that the financial scandals which adversely affect the public at large, if not the taxpayer directly, have not entirely ceased, although I did recently hear a good argument that the PPI mis-selling had had a very positive impact, as the 25 billion of compensation payments paid out so far had provided a significant boost to consumer spending in the sterling zone. Helicopter money by the back door, if you like. Very useful too. Increased capital, even when abetted by the extraordinary monetary policy manoeuvrings of the world's major central banks, has not been found to resolve issues. Indeed, it's probably the case that it may create some issues with the relatively high capital charges on equity investment, perhaps unduly restricting the amount of equity risk capital available to ensure a secure balance sheet for businesses in the non-financial services sector. In terms of capital supplied by banks, regulations certainly encourage banks to offer debt rather than equity, although that international regulation may well create opportunities for Guernsey private equity vehicles, so we probably shouldn't worry that much about it. If we believe that prudential regulation can clearly not resolve all issues to a reasonable degree, we've probably got a number of options. The first is to live with the low regard of the investing public for financial services firms, which goes with the diet of greed and malfeasance that the media feeds the public with in relation to financial services, fairly or unfairly. The second is to introduce very precise governance regulations in the fashion of the US 2002 Sarbanes-Oxley Act, in the belief that well-drafted regulations covering such things as auditor independence, corporate governance, internal control assessment, and enhanced financial disclosure backed by criminal sanctions could resolve issues, such as those exposed by Enron and WorldCom in the US. Thirdly, of course, there is a middle way in which we rely upon the boards of companies to make grown-up choices about how to run their businesses while taking robust action against those who clearly fail in their duties. I hope that it won't surprise any of you to know that the Commission does not favour a Guernsey version of Sarbanes-Oxley. We don't think that highly prescriptive regulation of the type exhibited in the Sarbanes-Oxley implementing provisions is a particularly cost-effective way of improving practices. Whilst the increases in auditor independence and CFO accountability for accounts, which were inculcated by Sarbanes-Oxley, can be commended, the cost of achieving those gains was high, and it is noteworthy that regulations did not effectively inhibit the poor quality decisions and the questionable corporate culture that came to light in many US financial institutions after 2008. Nor does the Commission think that all of us in this hall should simply be content to live with the status quo. The Commission believes that our reputation as a decent place in which people can both save and trade is vital to our prosperity, and that we, far less than the United States, can afford to tolerate poor conduct by financial and professional service firms if we are to have a prosperous future. The Panama Papers and the damage they have done to reputations of more than one Caribbean jurisdiction are a reminder, should we need one, of the importance of good conduct and of preserving our bailiwick's good name. Given this analysis, we consider that there is work to be done, but it is work which requires not the passing of a particular law. Important, though, having the right laws is to us all, as I'm sure the General Counsel would remind me, but rather continued and enhanced diligence in our daily activities by all of us in this hall. Lest any of you should think that I've taken examples of issues in other jurisdictions and extrapolated them to Guernsey without cause, I will offer some examples of poor conduct and poor corporate culture which the Commission has uncovered over the past year, depressing and unrepresentative though we may find it. To start, we've seen a case where an outsourcer falsified some sets of accounts he was preparing on behalf of a regulated firm to meet a deadline. The outsourcer in question was closely associated with the regulated firm and appears to have been working under the illusion that it was better to meet the deadline for preparation of the accounts than to do the job honestly. There was a breakdown of controls and an inappropriate corporate culture in this instance. Secondly, we've seen executive directors of an investment manager sitting on a fund board and not managing their conflicts of interest appropriately with regard to related party transactions, apparently not seeing the difference between their own interests and those of the fund's investors. Thankfully, in this instance, following strong steers from the Commission and the support of a non-executive director, conflicts now appear to be being managed more appropriately. At the enforcement end of the spectrum, when firms have come under investigation for anti-money laundering failings, in our root cause analysis of why the problems arose, we have often seen a dominant CEO and/or a culture driven by high profit margins and making a quick buck, with a total disregard for any form of meaningful compliance with the law. Whilst we appreciate that taking on complex clients is one of Guernsey's USPs, we have seen, on occasion, issues with high-risk clients being taken on without a firm's culture supporting the correspondingly enhanced compliance obligations relating to being on inquiry as to the source of the client's wealth. This behavioural trait can be associated with favoured introducers of business not being asked for appropriate background checks on those they introduce. We've also seen examples of a blame culture within a few weak firms, with former senior staff being readily, and in our minds unfairly, blamed by their current colleagues for systemic deficiencies in their compliance controls across client relationships, particularly in relation to serious weaknesses in arrangements for monitoring transactions and activities. Whilst we can readily understand the motivation for trying to deflect attention when the regulator is asking searching questions, the cultural willingness to take responsibility for fixing the messes in question has been noteworthy on occasion for its absence. Further to this, we have found examples which are a bit depressing, where the role of risk and compliance officers is denigrated by the board of the firm who set its cultural tone. This can take a number of different forms. At one level, there is simply failing to provide any training budget for compliance staff, letting them know they're on their own to work out how to fail without support. To be clear, this is not acceptable. Another example we've seen, which is a bit subtler, is impossible amounts of project work being loaded onto compliance and risk staff because they aren't the firm's fee owners. Unsurprisingly, this then results in delays building up in compliance work because their day job is sacrificed to meet non-risk-centred projects. Another way in which boards often set the wrong tone, often is probably a bit harsh, occasionally, is in dismissing the concerns of compliance officers about business the firm wishes to win. For example, a compliance officer who raised a reputational concerns about a proposal to accept as a client a man with I think it's fair to say, an unsavoury reputation from an African country, was overridden by the board, who argued that he had discarded his unsavoury reputation and that there were adequate controls in place. In this instance, the Commission went on to identify that the firm's controls were so poor that it had only identified that the unsavoury man had assumed beneficial ownership of a client company 4 months after it actually happened. In another case, the failure to follow the firm's own policies and procedures stemmed from the board's failure to do so. A director instigated his firm's procedure in respect of a politically exposed person by completing a PEP assessment form. This form, quite rightly, posed questions as to any adverse information available about the client. Despite the director being aware of the client's links to fraud and the misappropriation of funds, the director signed off the form without further action and continued to service the client in the normal way. This culture was then able to propagate throughout the firm on the basis that if the boss was not doing it, why should anybody else? We also see examples of trustee and company service provider board representatives of administered entities failing to communicate properly with external directors of those same administered entities. Many of our firms, I'm glad to say, recognise the value of an empowered and well-resourced compliance function that can provide guidance to the boards they traverse the regulatory landscape. Sadly, some don't. So, what goes wrong? Those are the issues. We're certainly not immune as a jurisdiction. What I think might be helpful at this juncture is a little analysis, at least for the vast majority of firms where poor practice is not the intended key success factor for the business. I think the first thing to say is that in our experience, bad things happen for all sorts of reasons. They're often not the result of some great pre-planned conspiracy. We may, when we read about them, draw some sort of comfort blanket around ourselves and reflect that something like that could never happen to a firm in which we were involved. What we often see is fundamentally decent people who, through force of circumstance, find themselves in a difficult place and fail to do quite the right thing, often with significant adverse consequences for themselves and others. Other issues we often see as we look at our hard cases relate to a lack of modesty and experience. What we see too often in Guernsey is previously successful people asked to do something outside their comfort zone, which promises to be profitable. What then happens is that they can fail to ask, for quite understandable reasons, appropriately searching questions to their potential counterparties. They then end up in a relationship which becomes something other than that which they probably intended, but from which they feel unable to extricate themselves. Whilst I'm probably as guilty as anybody in this hall of believing that with a little exertion you can mug up a subject well enough in a couple of weeks to be something approaching competent on it, I'm modest enough to realise that for me at least, it depends on the subject in question. Too often in Guernsey, we see a local industry practitioner who has got themselves into something about which they know nothing, which is clearly beyond his or her abilities to manage appropriately. As a result of this, a poor corporate culture with poor standards of governance can materialise with all the problems that these things tend to bring. So if that's the analysis, what can we do to make things better? It's all very easy sitting here talking about the problems and understanding why they happen. Well, what can we actually do to try and make things better? Well, at the Commission, we've been working to try to help by providing about 20 fairly informal educational sessions in 2016 to offer both officers and directors of firms the chance to interact with us, to discuss how to sensibly comply with the different aspects of the law in order to run a good quality business. The feedback on these education sessions is positive, and we intend to continue holding more of them, because helping people plan to avoid possible problems, people being willing, is generally much more efficient than letting them happen and then seeking to resolve them. It's also much less painful for everybody involved. So to the extent that you haven't been to one of our education sessions, be it on financial crime, fiduciary, investment, insurance, in the course of the year, I'd recommend looking out for them next year. We tend to be quite focused on certain topics where we appreciate our rules may be complex and people may want some practical guidance about how to interpret them. But then turning on to the things which we as directors can do, I think we need to seek to understand the business model. If we don't understand how our firm or a new enterprise makes its money or is meant to be making its money and the risks which it must take, we should probably not be that comfortable being involved with it. This isn't about us becoming unduly risk adverse. It's about us being aware of the risks we are taking and being comfortable that they are likely to be worthwhile. If we're running a high-risk enterprise, we need to understand how and what has to work for it to be profitable, what the warning signs will be that the business is not working out as we had hoped, and what we will do in such circumstances to try to ensure a soft landing of some description. I also think we need to make sure that our processes are actually being used. As I sit as a director of the International Association of Insurance Supervisors, I'm quite focused on saying, have actually people used the proper procedures we've put in place? I'm certainly not a great fan of embedding best practices, because I fully appreciate, especially in smaller businesses, the latest best practice fashion can well become the enemy of good practice. If that is, it is so complex that having been nicely written up, ready to be parroted during the next regulatory visit, it's then left on a shelf to gather dust because it's just too blooming complicated and difficult to apply in everyday life. I suggest we need to try and make sure that we have good processes and that they are actually being applied, because it's surely better to have a workable risk setup which is good than to have a theoretically best practice setup which is actually misunderstood or ignored, leaving you and others without the information you require or to help others manage organisational risks appropriately. I've found, as I'm sure many of you have, that one quick way in which a director can check is to consider for himself or herself a major decision which his or her firm has taken, and then to discuss with the risk officer how that decision actually interacted with the organisation's processes. Was it as laid down in the book, or did the decision strangely bypass half the processes because of exceptional circumstances? If we do find that a big decision taken by a firm of which we're a director did bypass most of our processes, we may well have cause to worry. It can also be helpful to consider honestly how much our fellow directors are going to challenge us and how we ourselves react when it happens. We need to consider their natural tendencies and our own. We need to consider whether there are intellectual equals and how dependent they are upon our goodwill for their continued financial well-being. These are all the facets of how much challenge we like to receive from them. If we find ourselves in a place where we do not think that our decision-making is likely to be subject to any intellectually credible challenge, we should probably consider whether our governance structure is actually working as we would wish, and whether it is helping keep us safe from harm. If we find ourselves in a position of being a director who feels under pressure not to challenge, we probably need to consider whether we're comfortable finding ourselves in that position, and whether there are techniques which we can use, such as, for example, explicit black hatting in discussion groups, to create a safe space to say some of the things which we would like to say, were the power dynamics not as they are. In a specifically Guernsey context, there's also the issue of boards which have only one non-executive director. This can sometimes create situations which are both lonely and difficult for the non-executive director, and the best solution can sometimes be to add an additional non-executive director, though I appreciate this is often an expensive solution for a smaller firm. We may also wish to think about the quality of the management information we receive or produce. If our board's committees and the board itself are to be effective, they need to receive appropriate management information. Stories abound of risk-adverse risk professionals who appear to think they're doing their job by providing part-time non-executive directors with hundreds of pages of reading on regulatory risks before each board meeting. When I'm given such accounts, I'm reminded of Pascal's famous remark, "I have only made this letter longer because I have not had time to make it shorter." As a non-executive director, chairing the Audit and Risk Committee of the International Association of Insurance Supervisors, I often find myself reflecting on whether my committee is being provided with the appropriate information to allow it to undertake its scrutiny function in an appropriate fashion. I can certainly see it as part of my role to secure sufficiently pertinent material and sufficiently clear agendas to allow my committee to do the job to the best of its ability. Contemporary British Army doctrine outlines the personal organisational skills needed to distill essential information in high-tempo environments where time's at a premium. Good staff officers, at least my chief operating officer tells me so, learn not to waste the precious time of their busy superior officer with excessive detail, and a bottom-line up-front culture prevails. I think it's helpful for us to regularly and consciously consider whether that which we receive to help us to do our jobs is good enough, and to be comfortable within ourselves to challenge if you're given yet another 700-page board paper when you know you've actually only got time to read 200 pages properly, and to say you actually want it improved and you want it better next time, so you can focus your precious expertise and precious time on the right issues. Thinking through about how outsourcing is managed can also be worthwhile. Almost all organisations outsource aspects of their operations. Henry Ford may well have found it most efficient to buy railroads and ships in the early 20th century to increase the efficiency of his production line. But since then, most organisations have massively increased outsourcing in the quest for cost savings and a focus on value-creating core competencies in the last 20 years. We may well wish to ask ourselves how the processes and culture we have established within our own organisations translate to the outsourced service providers, and further, what happens if the outsourced service providers fail in some fashion. Then there is reward. Working out the right reward structures is generally tricky. Many other jurisdictions now have specific national or supranational regulations on reward structures. Not all of them are perfect, and indeed the latest edition of the Harvard Business Review suggests almost all of them are highly imperfect, and many of us may well regard a lot of them as being over the top. Nevertheless, that doesn't mean that we can ignore the incentives which our teams have, and depending on the type of organisation we are running, we may wish to question whether incentives are spread over a long enough timescale to match the timescale of the risks they may be taking for investors. Whistleblowing, like remuneration, is another tricky area. If we wish to be in a position where we are fully aware of the risks our organisation faces, what incentives and what safeguards can we create to ensure that a potential whistleblower will have a quiet word with us, with one of our trusted colleagues, when he or she first feels uneasy? The alternative, for a regulated firm at least, that the potential whistleblower waits until the problem is much bigger and then gets so desperate that he or she comes to the Commission or to law enforcement to talk about the poor behaviour is, I'd suggest, probably not the mechanism you would choose to become aware of a problem in your own organisation. All too often it is well known within a firm that someone who puts up his or her hand about a real risk is saying goodbye to his or her future employment with that organisation. I don't think there's an easy answer to that, but I think we might ask ourselves whether that is really a sign of a healthy culture. In connection with this, a final point, which I often like to consider from various angles, is how we tolerate eccentricity. By this, I mean thinking about how we react and deal with those who don't quite fit into our organisation's culture. I don't mean how we deal with the lazy or those who are just not educationally suited, but rather those who've got the tendency to ask awkward questions in awkward ways at awkward times. Do we, for example, and I know I've been tempted, look for swift ways to manage them out of the organisation, sending them on coaching courses designed to achieve the politically acceptable equivalent of a lobotomy? Or do we value them because, like the canary in the coal mine, they can just occasionally keep our organisation safe by breathing foul air or treading where others fear to tread? So, you've listened patiently for half an hour. To summarise, what I've endeavoured to do is to explain how the regulatory canvas is changing as many policymakers come to appreciate the sensible bounds of prudential regulation and indeed its natural limitations. I've then tried to think about the difficult issue of poor corporate governance and culture and how it may arise before offering some thoughts on some of the techniques which we may all like to employ to guard ourselves against its consequences. I suppose my core message today is that whilst not quite as certain as death and taxes, poor corporate governance and culture can afflict us all, even in Guernsey, at any stage of our professional lives. We should not think that any of us are fully inoculated against these issues. The Commission doesn't believe in mammoth-sized prescriptive rule books as the solution, but we all need to be vigilant and willing to act to counter poor culture where we find it. In that way, I hope that we can collectively help preserve and enhance our bailiwick's reputation while securing our long-term future. Thank you very much.